And action. And it's just me today. Some of you may have already realized or understood. It's just me. So we announced that last week because Neil is slacking off. That's the only way to describe it. He's slacking off. Although there is a stand-in, and as you can probably see, there's this is Neil's stand-in for the week. It's his alter ego actually. It's a spurred animal, in fact. So we may get some comments from Neil's spurred animal. I'm not sure. He's sitting on a book there. He's got the Dictionary of Virginia Biography. Okay, so we'll probably have some interesting comments based on that this week. But in the absence of any comments from Neil's spurred animal, it'll be just me. And also, as I mentioned last week, or someone in the chat actually mentioned last week, if you have questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them or give you my opinion anyway on what the situation is. So yeah, we're basically talking again about really. I know there's other stuff that goes on in the world. Has been other stuff going on in the world over the past couple of months, and we've touched a little bit on them here and there, but primarily over the past couple of months it's been obviously the Ukraine situation and what's going on there. So I'm kind of focusing on that again this week because it's developing and it's kind of important and it's kind of multifaceted. It's a multifaceted situation. It's not just about obviously just about a war in Ukraine or a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's not just about Russia and Ukraine, those two countries. It's obviously much wider than that, and obviously we've talked about that in previous shows, and I'll flesh that out a little bit more today, hopefully. So as we mentioned, or as I mentioned, if there's any questions, Scotty, you can just throw them out at me willy-nilly. Don't even if they're not top quality questions, even if they're dodgy questions that you think the answer to is obvious, like they're duo questions, you can still throw them out.
All right. So far, they've expressed their amusement and happiness at Neil's alter egos.
Right. Yeah. He's gonna have to come back next week. Neil will be back next week, obviously, but I think we're gonna have to bring his spirit animal back next week as well with him to provide some spiritual support. Now that he's been introduced. So anyway, what's been going on? Well, propaganda, as usual, is par for the course when it comes.
Oh, we've got a question.
What is it?
BS wants to know, Joe, what is your spirit animal?
Oh yeah, that's a really important question. I don't know. I haven't actually investigated. I haven't. I don't know who you go to find out what your spirit animal is, but maybe make it up yourself. But I haven't really thought about it. Maybe you can suggest some things, and if I need a spirit animal for future shows. So if you suggest, maybe give us some suggestions of what my spirit animal might be, and we'll try and get one to accompany me in the show to give me some spiritual support as well. Any suggestions yet? No.
The fish.
The fish is there. You go. It's been here all along, sitting right. Yeah, my spirit animal is I think is it a salmon? I don't know what it is. It's a fish anyway, and it's for slapping people. So yeah, my my spiritual task in this life is to slap people with a fish, maybe.
A hummingbird or a beaver?
Who said that? A hummingbird. I bet that was...
I tells you says it's a hummingbird.
Yeah. I tells you, he's been trying to get me to have the hummingbird as my spirit animal, and he even bought me something to that effect. A little brooch, which I have, which is very nice. I'm just not sure we could get a hummingbird that's big enough to display on the show here, maybe you can. Maybe you can look that up, I tell you, and see if you can get me a stuffed hummingbird. I'd say that'd be hard to get, actually. Anyway, so what were we talking about? Ukraine, Russia. propaganda, like I said, is incessant and has been from the very beginning, to the point that most people who aren't paying attention or don't have a clue already have an extremely distorted view of what is actually happening in Ukraine, why it's happening, where it's going, because they've just been. I mean, we did a whole show last week, and we've done previous shows on similar topic of Russia losing. I mean, the incessant refrain from the Western media and Western governments that Russia is losing. Russia
Oh,
is
we've
losing.
got questions.
Oh God, go ahead.
Someone suggested perhaps an owl as your spirit
Oh,
animal.
right. Okay. Are there any questions that aren't related to my spirit
Yeah,
animal?
there are two.
Okay.
Bahar asks, Joe, do you think Yuki refugees will go back to their country once Russia has succeeded?
Ukrainian refugees, well, some of them will, I suppose. It depends on what Ukraine becomes after this conflict, because it's obviously going to, the situation is such that when this conflict concludes, in whatever way it concludes, Ukraine is going to be a very different country, very likely a lot smaller than it is today. So it depends where those refugees come from and whether they want to go back to the country they came from, because it won't be the same country, and depends where they came from. So some will, some won't. But I'd say, depending on how long it takes, it just depends on the person, I suppose. If a lot of them that went to Europe may find that that Europe isn't the land of milk and honey that they were promised or that they expected, and they're not being received. I mean, there's already reports from Germany. You may have seen them on Twitter and stuff, of people complaining about the behaviour of some, anyway, Ukrainian refugees. And I'm not saying that that's representative of all of them, but it's obviously not a good position to be in, to be a refugee in any country, and it's a toss up as to how it actually goes for you, and depends on your personality and all that kind of stuff. But I'd say the ones that have gone to Russia have gone there willingly and had strong ties with Russia already, and if they're there for a year and they get settled, they'll probably stay in Russia. But obviously some may go back to Ukraine. But like I said, it depends on what Ukraine ends up looking like when all of this is done, or what the world looks like effectively when all of this is done, I suppose, because it probably is going to have global implications by the time it's all finished, and the ramifications of what's happening right now in terms of energy supplies and all that kind of stuff are going to have are having ramifications, and will have more serious implications for
Oh my
Europe
God.
as well.
There's a Russian person posting rapid fire questions.
Can we just have one at a time?
Yes. Okay, so next question from earlier was from Jeff. Would you opine upon how to respond to people who are caught up in the Russia bad narrative and they're eliciting some kind of response? Like in, day-to-day conversations with people where the people are just,
Yeah.
he clarified later.
People are saying Russia bad,
Yeah.
and how you respond to that. Well, I mean, again, you probably know this, Jeff, but it's probably it's the situation is that whether or not the person is has an open mind. I mean, if they've decided on the Russian bad thing, which is purely fabrication of the Western media and Western governments, and that's all they know and that's all they want to know, then there's no point in actually trying to explain anything to them. But if someone has if there's a chink in their consciousness, I suppose, or it's a little bit open, the main thing to do would be to, I suppose, explain the basics of it, or you explain the Donbass, and you try and get them to understand that over the past, at least 15 years, but I mean, you could go back right back to, after the Second World War and the first Cold War, and the creation of NATO, and what the purpose of NATO was for, and in those 80 years, if you wanted to go back that far, the purpose of NATO was to effectively secure Europe ostensibly it was to ensure peace within Europe, supposedly, but it hasn't acted very peacefully over the past, let's say, 20, 25 years. Anyway, NATO hasn't, but that's because since then it was primarily led by the US, but the main goal of NATO, led by the US, was to control, keep Europe looking west, keep the Western Europe looking west rather than looking east, and forming ties particularly with Russia. So under US leadership, that has taken right from the very beginning, taken a very antagonistic approach, an aggressive approach against Russia in various different ways, and you can maybe explain those. You probably know them, the way that Russia has been demonized and Putin has been demonized over the past 15 years or so by Western governments, unfairly, unjustifiably, most of them lies. And how that led up to the overtake of Ukraine in 2014 in a coup. I mean, it depends on does the person you're talking to know that there was a coup in 2014 in Ukraine, a US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014 that basically overthrew the existing government and installed an pro-Western, anti-Russian government in Ukraine, and let loose the extremist anti-Russian forces within politics and within the military in Ukraine in 2014. Does the person you're talking to know that? Do they need that explained to them? Because the last 8 years are really where it gets concentrated into kind of the worst of the threats and aggression against Russia, and causing Russia to do what it has done a couple of months ago, which was take action to offset or prevent the culmination of the plans that the US had been putting in place for Russia using Ukraine. I've talked about that in previous shows, where it was basically the plan clearly was to first and foremost invade Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, and cause massive death and suffering, and also try and retake Crimea. And that would have been just the beginning if they were successful, in that they would have probably pushed across the border into Russia. So Russia was facing a threat of invasion by extreme right-wing elements leading the Ukrainian military and in politics. And it was effectively an existential threat to Russia, and it had to do something about it. Now, that's obviously completely ignored. It's not mentioned at all in the Western media, except maybe a little short comment that serves to dismiss that idea as Putin's delusions or whatever, But the facts of the matter are, anybody who wants to appraise themselves with the facts can simply look at the history and look at the plans that were in place, and a lot of them are being revealed now in terms of information that's coming out of Ukraine, of the plans that they actually had to invade Donbass, retake Donbass and Crimea. And there was no reason to assume that the Russians maybe had more information, but there's no reason to assume that they were going to stop at that point. But even if they didn't cross the border at that point, where they retook Donbass and Crimea, they were going to be a persistent threat, antagonistic entity, effectively towards Russia for the foreseeable future. And there's no country in the world would, if they're able to stop that happening, would just sit back and allow it to happen. But it's sad, it's sad that people don't know that fairly basic history. But there's obvious reasons why they don't know them, is because the Western media and Western governments steadfastly refuse or prevent them having access to that kind of information through the normal channels. So you have to look to other channels in order to try and appraise yourself of the actual facts of the situation. Anyway, that was a long-winded answer, but carry on.
Okay, so next question from Zoya. She's the one who sent 4 questions.
Oh, is it 4 in a row?
Sounds like a KGB agent.
Yeah.
Her first question is, please provide your take about what happened to the Moskva, the flagship Russian destroyer.
That smacks of, first and foremost, of it doesn't mean that Ukraine couldn't have done it, but given that this is a war, a proxy war being waged by the US using Ukrainian forces, it's a proxy war waged by the US against Russia, and that the US is directing this war effectively from within Ukraine, has complete control over Ukrainian government, because the government in Ukraine was installed by the US in 2014. They've complete control over the politics, the political sphere within Ukraine, and they also, by extension, they have control over the military, because they're providing all of the military know-how, all of the military technology, weaponry, etc., to Ukraine. So the US has complete control over it. So the sinking of the Moskva was, it was a propaganda win for those forces, which is first and foremost the U.S., by extension the Ukrainian government, etc. But it was a propaganda win. They planned it. They most likely carried it out because Ukraine did not have at that time, as far as I understand, any significant anti-ship missile technology, and the Russians knew that, and they were probably on a state of readiness that was proportionate to their understanding of the threat from the actual Ukrainian military and the kind of anti-ship missiles or missiles that they had that could attack a ship and could defeat the anti-missile defenses that the Moskva had. So I don't know. I'm not going to say I know how it exactly happened, but it was undoubtedly carried out probably by the U.S., by elements of the U.S. military / intelligences, whatever, from Ukrainian territory, or even from Romanian territory, close to the border with Ukraine. Who knows? Because either there's the border right there, and the Moscow was just off the coast, not far off the coast, maybe 75, 80 kilometers off the coast, south of Odessa, and off the coast of Romania as well. So they had ample opportunity to target it. How they did it, I don't know, but the US has fairly advanced, fairly modern, and even not yet in active service. They have new anti-ship missiles that they could well have used. There's also a possibility that it was targeted by more than just land to air missiles, basically from land to sea, but they could have been targeted by torpedoes as well at the same time. It's hard to know because the Moskva sank. There's some evidence, the few pictures we have, you could infer that, or you could interpret that that at least some of the damage was right at the waterline, which doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't a land-based, land-launched missile, but it could also be suggestive of torpedo strikes. So, but it was, the fact they haven't gone around shooting any other Russian ships, Russian military ships, suggests that this was a one-off, calculated, targeted, meticulously planned attack in order to achieve a propaganda coup, a propaganda victory against the Russians. And the Russians took in their stride and just carried on. And you haven't heard of any. You didn't hear of any significant attacks before that. You haven't heard of any significant attacks since. So, what I mean? It suggests the fact there hasn't been any other Russian Navy vessels shot means that Ukraine doesn't have this any significant ability to attack en masse, or to attack, repeatedly attack Russian ships, Russian Navy ships. So that strongly, in my opinion, argues for it being the work of someone with that ability, but only with the ability to do it on a one-off event kind of thing, So yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and that's kind of that's I lost the question now. There's the question. That's a bit everybody looks at like Russia and says, oh, they're the only country with hypersonic weapons and blah blah blah, and that's pretty much true. The US says, oh, we're testing them, but you also have to remember that like if say this was the CIA that did it or something, like you say it was a one-off thing. Maybe they had some dude on the inside. Maybe they had some inside information. They said, well, hey, maybe we can do this because we know they have this kind of system. They don't know, missile defense system on the ship. They don't know exactly how it works. Yeah. And they go, okay, let's like basically show them who's boss here. Say like, yeah, we're like the big deep state world global leaders, and we're gonna. And then people are like, well, why doesn't Putin respond? And like, well. Obviously, because he doesn't want to start World War III,
right.
And also it's like if what Putin said is true, assuming that it's true, and that Ukraine has been at least eastern and southern Ukraine has been kind of Nazis and this kind of nightmare scenario, then why did he wait 8 years to go in? I mean, just because you have weapons, you have to manufacture a whole boatload of them. I read something that said, Russia's fired something like 5% of its missile stock. Well, they've fired thousands and thousands of missiles already.
Yep.
So, from what I can tell of the way Russians work, it's basically they do everything slowly and carefully and methodically, and they're not going to fly off the handle. You know, especially if they think it's a one-off thing.
Yeah. I'm
They're just
pretty
gonna
sure
go,
they
okay.
read that it was a one-off thing from the very beginning, and the problem is that once you do that, and you don't have it's like the CIA or whoever, some aspect of military intelligence. The CIA has their own army basically, and have had for a long time, that they can pull on whenever they want. But uh, you know, they do this one-off, and it's a propaganda move in order to sink the Moscow, right? The Moscow ship, the flagship of the naval fleet. It's a propaganda coup. They do it once. The Russians obviously get wise to it, and then you can't do it again,
Yeah.
right? Because that's part of the problem. And but this, it's definitely, it fits. It's within the context of from the very beginning, the ongoing propaganda war that has been waged against the pro-Ukraine propaganda war that has been waged by Western media and Western governments. From the very beginning, there's they put out this thing about the Ghost of Kiev, and the Snake Island ship, right? Fuck you, Russian warship, and then we all died. No, we didn't actually. It was entirely made up. And the Ghost of Kiev was like he shot down 40 Russian jets. One guy shot down 40 Russian jets, and it's interesting because in the BBC, if you go to the BBC article there, it was just, I don't know why they brought it up today or whatever, but it's from 2 hours ago. How Ukraine's Ghost of Kiev legendary pilot was born. Now that's kind of an interesting, title when you look at the actual substance of the story, which was that it was entirely made up. But so the BBC says it was the legendary pilot was born. There is no legendary pilot, and he was never born. It was a fake story made up, probably, in the Pentagon or in the U.S. State Department, and given to the Ukrainians to disseminate, and they disseminated it as part of the propaganda war. And they understand that this propaganda war, information war, is extremely important. The reason it's extremely important is to encourage, to support the Ukrainian people, and more importantly, the Ukrainian military, in order to get them to keep fighting and dying, throwing themselves like cannon fodder at the Russian army. That's it fits with the whole idea of, as the US has said repeatedly, in one way or another, that they want to, they'll fight to the US will fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, which is exactly what's happening. And as part of getting them to continue to fight to the last Ukrainian, they need stuff like the Ghost of Kiev, they need stuff like Snake Island, they need stuff like the sinking of the Moskva, to give the Ukrainian people that kind of support and a feeling that they can win, and that's why also, they've been saying repeatedly, Russia's losing, which is entirely false, but they keep saying it. But in this story anyway, if you just go down a little bit, it says it describes the Ghost of Kiev. So basically, the essence of the story is on the third paragraph here. But now the Ukraine Air Force Command has warned on Facebook that the Ghost of Kiev is a superhero legend whose character was created by Ukrainians. We ask the Ukrainian community not to neglect the basic rules of information, hygiene, the message said, urging people to check the sources of information before spreading it. So 2 months, more or less, after they actually spread this information, now they tell people, listen, don't believe everything you read on the internet, especially when we put it out there. So it was used as a marketing brand by a Ukrainian model aircraft manufacturer, while a person showed off a military badge inspired by the legend. So they're putting out, paraphernalia associated with the Ghost of Kiev and stuff. Scroll on down there, you can see a picture. They put out someone on Telegram of some dude from probably 10 years ago, some Ukrainian dude in a plane. Yeah, further down, that dude there. And right underneath it, a Ukrainian military expert who requested anonymity told the BBC the Ghost of Kiev story has helped to raise morale at a time when people need simple stories. Ukraine's morale has also been boosted by the Moskva story. And then they mentioned the Snake Island ship under the Snake Island story underneath that. Blah blah blah. But the interesting part is at the very end, the last two, or the last paragraph really, it stuck out for me anyway. Justin Crump of the security consultancy Sibylline. So I don't know who this guy is. Anyway, he says something interesting, which is that the Ghost of Kiev legend is important in our social media age. Is important because in our social media age, people need myths, heroes, and legends to provide cohesion and meaning. So, and that sounds like it might be true, because, myths provide meaning, but there's a caveat. Myths that provide meaning, that are positive, are myths that are generally true, that convey a general truth about the human condition, a story that it's a narrative or whatever, and it can be a bit fantastical, but it can be understood as being how it translates down to human experience and lessons from the human experience, and positive lessons, how to overcome things. But that's not what's going on here, because the myth here about the Ghost of Kiev is that this, if you to translate it into reality, it's that the Ukrainian military and people are fighting a good fight against Russian aggression. And that's not actually true. That's not what's going on, as I kind of mentioned at the start of the show, and as we've mentioned in previous shows. That's not actually what's happening in Ukraine. So the Ghost of Kiev as a myth is a fake myth and effectively a lie. So that little quote from that guy should be changed to that rather than people need myths, he says that in our social media age, people need lies to provide meaning. And that's what they're being given. They're being given lies that supposedly provide meaning, but they don't provide any meaning because it's based on a lie, and it's not it doesn't translate accurately to what's actually happening in the world and how things are going, what's happening, and what is likely to be the outcome. That people are being led to believe that the Ukrainian military is fighting for all our freedoms, etc., etc. And this is being repeated has been repeated over the past 2 months over and over again by Western politicians. If you go to there's a Russian Twitter link there, Scotty. It was actually Zelensky UA status. Is that Zelensky? Actually, it's Zelensky. Sorry, I didn't even know it was him, but it's Zelensky's actual Twitter account. And guess who was in war-torn Kiev, just strolling along the streets recently? It was our old friend for the children, Nancy Pelosi. She went and met Zelensky. Her and Adam Schiff actually. Just play it there.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. Pleasure to meet you.
Jim McGovern from Massachusetts. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
They're all very proud to meet Zelensky.
Yes. You're welcome. Jason Crow from Colorado. Nice to meet you.
Adam Schiff from California.
You're very
Bug-eyed
welcome.
Schiff from California. So, yeah, I just wanted to hear what
Я вам
Nancy said at the
вдячний
end.
по-перше, за цей сигнал
Бла, 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 бла,
потужної
бла.
підтримки України, потужної підтримки Сполучених Штатів, народу Сполучених Штатів, Конгресу і двопалатної підтримки, і двопартійної. Цей сигнал високо ціную я як президент, наша команда і народ України.
Your freedom, we say thank you.
Суверенітет і територіальну цілісність.
We believe that we are visiting you to say thank you for your fight for freedom, that we are on a frontier of freedom, and that your fight is a fight for everyone. And so our commitment is to be there for you until the fight is done.
Nancy gets a medal. Nancy gets a medal as a hero of Ukraine.
Wait.
For the
What?
children.
For the
For the
children.
children.
For the children.
For the children.
She's doing it for the Ukrainian children. So yeah, she basically is propagating again that myth of that there's a fight for freedom, that she's here to show support and offer all the help that they can in Ukraine's fight for freedom, because they're fighting a fight for everyone. That the fight for freedom in Ukraine is a fight for freedom globally around the world, which again is false. And that's the myth. It's a false myth. So it's a shit myth. Basically, it's a useless myth. People shouldn't be subscribing to that myth in the same way you shouldn't subscribe to the Ghost of Kiev myth. I mean, if I put myself in the opposite position, if I was, a party to a conflict where the country I lived in was being invaded, I would not want to. I mean, I don't know what I'd think about them propagating that myth, but I certainly wouldn't believe it myself, and I wouldn't support it, and I wouldn't propagate it myself. A myth, a story about what was happening in terms of, the armed forces that I was a part of, or the armed forces that I was supporting. I wouldn't want to spread lies about their military success, when that's not what's actually happening, when they're being generally defeated and stuff, because like we said, or like I said, like me and Neil, Unicorn Neil said, the point of this support to Ukraine, the moral support to Ukraine, isn't that right, Neil? Nod if you agree. Okay. The point of moral support to Ukraine is to continue the war, to keep the Ukrainian military fighting for America for as long as possible, in America's geopolitical war against Russia, long-standing geopolitical war against Russia, and to sacrifice as many Ukrainian lives, both military and civilian, as necessary in order for America to achieve its aims of, attempting to, put Russia in its place. It's actually, I have a quote here. Lloyd Austin, who is the Pentagon chief, said recently, he was actually a Raytheon, he peddled Raytheon weapons. He was basically a Raytheon sales executive, before he went to the Pentagon, which is, understandable. He said, I'm not sure if it was this week or a little bit before, but he said, we want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So that obviously extends it out. What does he mean exactly by the kinds of things? What other kinds of things, similar to Ukraine, is America concerned that Russia would do if it wins in Ukraine, if it achieves its objectives in Ukraine and is seen to emerge victorious? What other kind of things is the Pentagon concerned about that Russia would do? I think again there's more propaganda and disinformation here, in the sense of it would bring up the idea that, once Russia's done with Ukraine, it'll go to Poland next, or it'll go to the Baltics, or it'll basically invade other parts of Europe, which is highly, highly unlikely. Russia has no intention, has never made any statements to that effect, or shown any inclination towards invading or attacking any other European country. It was forced into attacking Ukraine effectively because, as I explained earlier on, it was put in that position by the US. But the main thing, I think, so part of the propaganda in terms of getting NATO behind, all of these measures against Russia, and getting the European Union to support all of these sanctions, etc., and military aid to Ukraine. That's part of the propaganda or part of the propaganda they use to get Europe behind this US-led attack effectively on Russia through Ukraine, is to I just had a mind blank. Anyway, the point is, they're concerned that if Russia were to emerge victorious in Ukraine, they would ultimately, that would put Europe in a position where they were effectively cowed. That Europe would be concerned that, given, do a standby for a minute, will you?
And we're back.
And we're back. Sorry, I had a little emergency interruption there. What was I saying? I can't actually remember what I was saying. Well, yeah, go ahead. I'll get back to it anyway. I'll get back to the point, yeah.
We'll just go on to the next
Yeah.
question. So next question is, do you think the conspiracy theories are true and there's a biolab under Azovstal?
Probably not. I
No?
mean, there's been plenty of there's lots of other biolabs were identified. I think 30 in Ukraine were discovered or revealed over the past couple of months. So I mean, it fits with the kind of it fits with the idea of biolabs, of deep secret underground biolabs. Maybe you could go to like human animal experimentation or creating super soldiers or something like that. You know what I mean? Because there's all these underground tunnels basically, and it's a vast area. In Avostal, it's possible, but I don't think there'd be necessarily any different from any of the other biolabs that were discovered in Ukraine. And we talked about that last week, where the information, there was information revealed about what was going on in these biolabs in terms of, and part of it was, one aspect was they were using migratory birds to try and transmit, or to, come up with a plan to transmit various pathogens attached to the birds, that they would migrate around different countries, Russia, any other country, and then you would kill the bird and the toxin would be released. Kill the bird with a chip or something like that, So, I mean, yeah, I don't know, but I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say it's any different from any of the other biolabs, basically, is the point.
I think it was kind of interesting that, like, they had there was, I can't remember where it was a video or something, and they had I think it was on South Front, actually.
Mm-hmm.
They had a video that was shot inside Azovstal, supposedly.
Right.
And they had a bunch of, like, they had a translated transcript of what people were saying, and there were like women and children there, and like one of them said point blank, like, I think she said, yeah, we were told that we were going to a green zone, a safe, safe passage to get out, to get out of Ukraine, basically, and we ended up here, and we haven't seen the sun in, a month and a half or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they knew they were going to fall back there because it's this underground tunnel. It's like an underground bunker type thing, but with all the other revelations of all the other labs, like you were saying,
Yeah.
it seems to me like it's, and of course the Russians wouldn't want to go in and bomb it, because if they've got a bunch of civilians in there,
Right.
then the Russians get blamed for it, and
It's kind of,
I don't know.
It's sickening to I mean, just over the past few days they've been talking about Avostal, and in the media, in the Western media, and they've been talking about how, I mean, they completely flip the narrative all the time, despite the fact that they have the information that, what the Russians have said. They flip the narrative and say that Russia is holding, won't let civilians leave Avostal, which is completely the opposite of the truth, and it's a truth that's backed up by evidence from the past 2 months in other parts of Ukraine, where the Ukrainian military, certain aspects of the Ukrainian military, have been, using human shields, basically. So it totally makes sense that the Ukrainian forces hold up in Avostal would have taken, if they were able to, have taken civilians with them in order to ensure a level of protection, because they know that, I mean, it goes against the whole narrative that's been going on for 2 months, that Russia is killing civilians. In Bucha, it's just slaughtering civilians left, right, and center. But then, across the board, for the past 2 months across Ukraine, the Ukrainian military have been using, either directly or indirectly, human shields, because they know that by implication, the clear implication is that they know that the Russian military is very reluctant to kill civilians. Why would you have civilian shields otherwise? If you thought that your enemy, the Russians, had no regard whatsoever for civilian life, having civilian shields wouldn't help you at all. So it's a tacit admission that they know that the Russians are careful to avoid civilian casualties. So the idea that they won't let civilian casualties, or won't let civilians out of Avostal, is false, and in fact it flies in the face of what the Russians have said, which is they want the civilians to leave Avostal. I mean, only civilians, though. They want only civilians to leave. And I mean, there's been a few have been released the UN got involved recently, and there was a few dozen were released recently on buses just yesterday and today, I think, or yesterday. But the Russians are quite adamant that only civilians, i.e., on these buses or any transfer of civilians out of Avastal does not include Ukrainian military personnel dressed up as civilians. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of off topic in terms of the actual question. I don't think there's anything crazy going on necessarily in the underground bunkers, the deep tunnels under Avastal, other than it being used to, hide a bunch of right-wing extremist Ukrainian nutjobs.
Yeah, the flavor of that whole thing, like when it first came out, it was like, it kind of struck me as a bit like the Q thing, and it's like why if Russia's announcing stuff like oh yeah, they're using birds to distribute germs and whatever, vials of whatever, then did they ever come out and say, yes, there's this super duper lab under there and it's the center of operation? It was basically just kind of rumors that were spreading around the internet, and you're going like, well, is that true? Where did that come from?
It's not the kind of place you would put, I know it's a big area, but I don't think it's the kind of place where you'd put a sensitive biolab under a steelwork. You know what I mean? With thousands of people working there every day and stuff. I mean, it just doesn't sound like it's plausible. Yeah, what were the other questions?
Next one is, what is your take on the 2 murder-suicides of ex-managers of large Russian companies?
We talked about that last week, didn't we? Or did we?
Oh yeah, I think we did actually.
Yeah, the conclusion last week was that it's a dangerous business to be in. We don't know the specifics. I mean, we said last week it's presented as this is Russia, assassinating members of, or executives of these oil or gas companies because they're not doing what Russia wants or what Putin wants or something like that. But it could just as easily go the other way, where they're being taken out for reasons that are more relevant to the Western sanctions agenda, basically. So, and yeah, one of them was in Spain, I think, in Marbella, a guy. And his fingerprints weren't on the weapon, that kind of stuff. But I haven't actually looked into the details of it, and it's hard to know in those situations. But it's not a good business to be in right now, and especially if you're not fully aligned with one side or the other. If you're somewhere in the middle type thing, you're in danger, basically. So yeah.
Yeah, and that one I was, because if they're oligarchs, let's say, I was thinking the other day. Like, I mean, okay, yeah, we want to think that, Putin is great, and, like, you've got the FSB or whatever, and, Putin fully controls them. But I mean, look at how it is in the West. You've got a civilian government, and then you've got intelligence agencies doing whatever they want. Thing. There's drug running and money laundering and all this stuff going on, and like, it could very well be that some secretive branch or even the more public branch of some Russian secret service went in and knocked these guys off, not because Putin ordered it, but because, I mean, for that you'd have to know that, exactly. Is Russia like most Western countries, where of course the intelligence agencies are running around offing people because they know that kind of thing, and
the one place like was, I think it was Marbella in Spain, and that's like a hotbed of all sorts of money laundering gangs and criminal gangs, and has been for a very long time. There's been plenty of people who have been suicided or killed or assassinated or whatever in that area of Spain, and on the south coast of Spain, for those specific reasons. So I mean, it could a third option is it could just as easily be some kind of gang warfare, basically, that people got on the wrong side of, But I don't think it's that significant, to be honest. In the broad scheme of things.
Next question. There are a lot of cases of all kinds of large fires erupting all over the world. Some are natural, some are industrial, some are weird. Do you think it's normal, or is there a connection, or what?
That's a really tough one. We talked about that one last week as well. We detailed there was something like, there are reports of like a dozen, and then there's other, if you add them together, there's something like 16 or 18. There was one in the UK, a sausage factory in the UK, I think yesterday. It's super, super weird, to be honest. And I don't know if it's kind of confirmation bias in the sense of people have been talking about food shortages, possible food shortages, seeing food shortages in supermarkets, etc. And that's in the air. It's in the collective unconscious, let's say. So whenever there's a fire in a sausage factory or a fire at a food distribution plant, etc., suddenly it gains much more importance, in people's minds, and they notice it, and it gets spread on social media. We mentioned last week that these kind of things do happen very often. I think in the US it was something like 1,000 warehouse fires are responded to by the fire departments across the US every year. That's 1,000 of them. We're here only talking about a couple of dozen, but it is notable that most of them were food related. Is someone going around burning down food distribution, food processing, food production plants? There's a lot of them in the the world in general. For it to have a significant, or anything close to a significant impact on the food supply, it would have to be a lot more. There'd have to be a wave of these kind of fires or destructions of food processing plants for it to really, negatively affect or to have a direct impact on the food supply. I think, but it's just I put that into one of those, I don't know, almost like high strangeness or some kind of weird, in the weird category basically. And again, I allow for the possibility that these kind of things are appearing in front of our feed on social media because people are paying more attention to them when, and at all the times when those kind of things happen, people just go, meh, it was a fire in a sausage factory, big deal. A fire in a food processing plant, who cares? Yeah.
I think there's probably also like we just had a thing yesterday. I went to RT, and one of the top stories was 50% of the nuclear power plants in France are currently offline.
Right.
And I thought and then they mentioned the Gullfish 2 reactor,
Yeah.
which is,
Not far from here.
not far from here. And so I did what all good engineers do. I checked the incoming line voltage on my battery backup for my computer, and it was low. And I was like, oh yeah,
Right.
Friday into Saturday, blah blah blah. They shut down this reactor, and it was because they built them all in like the 70s or 80s or
Right.
whatever, and they said, oh well, there's like corrosion or something. And this is something that's been going on for at least since last year. Was the first article in the newspaper. And so it's like you could stop and you could go, well, hang on a minute here. Heating oil has gone up in price like almost double what it was last year.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's taxing everybody's pocketbooks basically. And then on top of it now, electricity is getting expensive because 50% of the reactors are offline, and and you go like, okay, well, is this actually a conspiracy, or is this just a symptom of the fact that basically Western society as a whole is kind of falling apart? And I mean, imagine everybody running around and they've all got their 52 booster shots and COVID vaccines,
Right.
and they're all losing their minds thinking that, no, we can't define what a woman is because And I mean, I see it in like the tech world all the time. People like software bugs are worse. I mean, have you tried to update Windows 10 like in the past several years? Like it just keeps borking everything,
Right.
far more than it did in the past because everything's just kind of falling apart. So I suspect that a lot of that is actually not part of some grand conspiracy. It's just kind of what happens when things start to deteriorate, and so
Right.
I'm sure some of it is a diabolical conspiracy, but I think they're just falling apart.
Yeah, that's a good explanation for a lot of stuff. Actually, things falling apart. But of course, you can question why things start to fall apart. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
But
and
you
it's-
just mentioned some stuff there. Yeah.
And there's probably a whole big long list you could name.
It's a process. Yeah. It's an ongoing process of generalized collapse, and it's not definable in that sense. It's a broad scale kind of macrocosmic or macro scale collapse, and it's hard to, when that starts to happen and it's diffuse across the whole system, it's hard to pinpoint cause and effect, other than to say that it's a generalized foobar.
Here's wait, let's do this second question first. Ania says, was it also a signal to Russia that the U.S. will not let Ukraine surrender, but will keep upping NATO support, which kind of ties into like the question that I have, which is, where is it going in terms of, you've got Poland sending troops, and they're all gonna, and Transnistria and all that stuff, and like, is it actually gonna evolve into, basically NATO countries get involved? And I mean, obviously that's impossible for us to answer, but
Well, what was the question? Was is it also a signal? Was what also a signal?
was it all to NATO? I was thinking it was referring to the.
Well, was okay. It's just
wait a minute.
it depends what it was.
Maybe that question
Referring to.
wasn't for us. I don't know.
Maybe it wasn't for us. Well, yeah. Anyway, the point that people need to remember, and I mean, it's been said over and over again, and it's become a meme, like I mentioned earlier on, is that the U.S. is willing to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. It's very possible that this conflict will expand beyond Ukrainian borders into Europe. To what extent it does that is yet to be seen, but it's I'd give it a fairly high likelihood that it will extend in some way or other outside of Ukrainian borders, not into Russia, but into Europe. And the reason for that is that, and here's where you get kind of conspiratorial, although it's not really conspiratorial if you know your history. The US wants that to happen. The US wants the conflict to spread because it knows that it can only do, the US and its NATO friends or whatever, but primarily the US, can only do so much for Ukraine in terms of helping Ukraine militarily, economically, etc. And the sanctions against Russia aren't obviously working at all very, very well. So it knows that if it continues on the current course, Russia will achieve its objectives in Ukraine, and we'll call it a win, and it will be a win. And Russia's standing in the world will increase quite a lot as a result, and most importantly, its standing in Europe will increase because it will have been seen to that it was able to invade Ukraine, effectively deal with the West, deal with the US, primarily in Ukraine, defeat them despite their best efforts, despite the West's best efforts. They defeated them, and in that sense, Russia's standing amongst particularly European countries will increase a lot, and that's a very bad situation for the US, because the US has a long-standing agenda, has had a long-standing agenda really since after the Second World War. I think I mentioned this earlier, that to keep Europe Western aligned, keep it aligned with the US, and to stop it from, aligning or becoming increasingly aligned with towards the east, and primarily with Russia as a major, obviously, I think the biggest country in the world with massive energy resources. That's a big threat for the US, because the US, maintains relevance and maintains its global hegemony primarily as a result of its capturing, I suppose, in a certain sense, you could say, capturing of Europe, of Western Europe after the Second World War, and it's Western Europe being effectively part of that NATO alliance and part of the Western alliance with the US at the head of it. If that was to break down, the US would eventually be sidelined as a global hegemon, and they really don't want that to happen. So that's why they're really insistent on this Ukraine conflict. That's why you're seeing all of the propaganda. That's why you're being subjected to all of the propaganda, the pro-Ukraine propaganda, the anti-Russian propaganda, because it's kind of existential for the US in the same way that it was existential for Russia, except that Russia's in the position of it's existential for Russia because Russia was threatened with an attack. It's existential for America because if it doesn't deal with Russia in the way that it wants to, it faces the prospect of becoming a kind of, well, at the very least, no longer the global hegemon, and having its economy shrink and contract, the petrodollar going the way of the dodo, and it all coming to an end for America as the global leader. So they would like, and again, Europe is extremely important in that respect. It's vital in that respect of maintaining America's dominance in the world. If Europe goes east, then it's all over. So it might sound cynical to a lot of people, but America probably has a plan right now, like I said, that this war with Russia should be should extend or expand to Europe, primarily as a way to weaken Europe, not to necessarily weaken Russia. They've probably figured that they can't, despite all the rhetoric, they can't achieve their goals of what did he call it? We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kind of things that it has done. They probably realize that, the clearer heads realize that they can't achieve that Russia is on its own path now, and there's no turning, and it's not going to be brought down in the way that they want to bring it down. So the next option is to weaken Europe, basically make Europe more subservient, more needy, more dependent on the US than it is today. And you can do that by facilitating the extension of the war in Ukraine to Europe. And it's bizarre that European leaders, I don't know, they're just sleepwalking into this, basically. And it's not good. But of course, there's lots of other things happening at the same time. That's a plan that they have, I think. But there's lots of other things happening at the same time that, you know, could throw a spanner or monkey wrench in the works type thing. But I mean, in that respect, the most obvious one is the energy, is the sanctions and the energy policies that obviously are being pushed by the US on Europe to divest themselves as much as possible, to the greatest extent possible. You know, maybe not immediately, but progressively cut off their usage and reliance on Russian energy, and that has only one very clear, very obvious end result, which is the kind of mothballing of large parts of European industry, particularly German industry. You know, depends on the country and the reliance on Russian energy. But I mean, the Germans have been explicit about this. I mean, they've said, like, if we cut off Russian gas and oil, we're screwed. Like, our economy's just it's in the toilet. It's going down. But that's what, you know, those sanctions are obviously US sanctions. Europe is being blackmailed, or interesting word, blackmail, actually, because that's what what do you call her, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU chief, accused Russia of doing by supposedly denying Europe, Poland and Bulgaria most recently, denying them, cutting off gas to Poland and Bulgaria. She could call that blackmail. But it's actually the Americans who are effectively blackmailing Europe to force them to stop paying for Russian energy supplies, for Russian gas and Russian oil. It's bizarre that she calls it. It's like if I have a product and I sell it to people and you're my customer, and if one day you decide that you're not going to pay me anymore, and I say, well, if you're not going to pay me for my product, I'm going to stop giving it to you. You're not getting my product anymore. And your response is to accuse me of blackmailing you. That's the kind of thinking. And I mean, there's no spin on that. There's no way you can spin what she said to make it make any sense. That's literally what's happening. Bulgaria and Poland, who had their gas supply shut off, at least nominally or officially shut off by Russia recently, she accused Russia of blackmailing Europe and blackmailing these countries. But the reason they were shut off was because Poland and Bulgaria effectively refused to pay for the gas. How is that blackmail? I mean, if you don't pay, you don't get. But it's blackmail to not get stuff for free. If you don't give me stuff for free, you're blackmailing me. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to even talk about this stuff because it's so nonsensical. You know, it's so idiotic. But apparently, you need to explain these things to people because people will actually buy that. There's probably a lot of people out there who think today that Russia is blackmailing, using gas and oil in a manipulative, coercive way, and blackmailing European countries and blackmailing Poland and Bulgaria by cutting off their supply, when the simple reality is that Poland and Bulgaria stopped paying for Russian gas. If you don't get any. What else is there to say? Other than it's blackmail.
Speaking of the U.S. and EU and crazy making, we have another question from Alejandro.
Mm-hmm.
He asks, what do you make of the recently launched Ministry of Truth in the U.S. and the EU? Do you think you'll have trouble, or is it more of a desperate attempt for control?
The Ministry of Truth.
The, what do they call it? The official name was the something.
Yeah, Jen Psaki talked about disinformation. I mean, they spin that. They're doing a similar thing in the UK. They've got an online security bill that's passing in the UK or whatever, and they spin it as protecting people to make all online discourse or all, online, basically people's experience online, to make it as safe as possible. And they kind of spin that as primarily being, for example, against any kind of violence online or any kind of manipulative or coercive kind of abuse online, online abuse or attempts to traffic children online, or child pornography, that kind of stuff. They kind of spin it in that way, but they leave it open at the same time to be anything that they decide is offensive, or they decide is dangerous. Dangerous to whom? Who knows? It's weird because it's the kind of thing that what they're basically saying is that there's information that there's speech or ideas that you will be able to speak or talk about in a local bar or local pub, or in your own house or with friends or anywhere publicly in person, but you're not allowed to say that online, which is kind of weird. And of course it comes at a time when everybody thinks that Elon Musk is going to save the world by buying Twitter. Of course, it doesn't matter who owns Twitter. If Donald Trump owned Twitter, it wouldn't matter, because the bottom line is that the policing of what actually appears on Twitter will be done, in theory, according to the government, will be done by the government. So they will be able to, they're the ultimate authority, and they will be able to sanction or suppress or prevent people from saying certain things on Twitter. And it doesn't matter who owns it. It doesn't matter if Elon Musk agrees wholeheartedly with your speech on Twitter. If the government doesn't like it, the government will force Twitter and therefore Elon Musk to remove your speech online. Yeah, that's what's going. It's been going that way for a very long time, obviously. But
you have to understand, when you have like social media and stuff, when you look at the history of Google and how it started. Larry Page, PhD thesis funded by DARPA. Like, why did Facebook become popular?
Right.
Why did Twitter become popular? Technically, Twitter was a steaming pile of crap. I always love telling this story.
Yeah.
Jack Dorsey, whatever, wrote this thing in Ruby on Rails, and it was so god awful that they had to, when they got like $20 million in funding from venture capitalists, which we all know what venture capitalists are, and of course, in retrospect, you go, well, yeah, but how did they know? Like, assuming that there are like intel agencies that fund these things and give you this venture capital, how did these people know that this would turn into Twitter or that would turn into Facebook, and it would become a means of controlling people? And I don't think it really happens that way. I think it just kind of they get an idea and they see how it goes and they throw some funding, because it's for them 20 million, 100 million, whatever. They throw some money at it, and then all along the way you get the venture capital funding, but they've always got their back door, and they're like, yeah, let us in here, and you're like, yeah, okay, and the more you play nice with them, the more money they throw at you, and the bigger you become,
right?
And then people start seeing the application of it, even they themselves, the intel agencies, whoever, and they keep throwing money at you. They keep their back door. They keep their control. They, boards of directors. They get the other bigwigs in, and suddenly you have a giant, multinational social networking corporation that can say, no, you can't say that. What happened with the Capitol building and the whole Trump thing, and you can't say that it was not a revolution, or you'll be banned, or you can't say,
Which is ridiculous. Like, I mean, I suppose it's just the spread of what they perceive as the spread of information on social media compared to in person, right? In person, you can only say, you're not going to speak to tens of thousands of people, right? Usually, in person in the town square. Although you can do, if you try hard enough, you can have concerts and stuff like that. But and if people want to listen to you, but on social media, it's easier to have a large audience and to influence what people think. And yeah, it just shows how the information war, as we've been saying, is paramount in these people's minds. You know, information is extremely important because the information that is contained within your head on how you see the world, the way you view the world, informs your actions and informs what you'll in any given moment, what you'll do or what you won't do, or I mean, it doesn't change that much, but it's something even more intangible about it that I don't know if they're aware of it or if it's important to them, but there's something even more intangible, it seems, than it informing your actions or whatever. It's just the fact that you don't believe. I think it must be a group thing, basically, where they fear that if there's a large enough number of people in any country or in the world who have a certain idea about something, well then, and if that runs counter to what they want, what they believe, or what they want people to believe, or what they want to do, then that mass of people who believe the opposite of what they say will in some way stop them from being able to achieve what they want to achieve. It's a weird thing. I'm sure it has practical applications, and they plan it out. They, game it all out type thing. But a good example is the Ukraine thing, where in that article about the Ghost of Kiev from the BBC, the guy said explicitly, people need these myths, these beliefs, lies, basically, stuff that's made up that isn't reflective of reality at all, because it keeps their morale up. And the way that translates into a tangible reality is that in the context of Ukraine, is that it keeps the Ukrainian people supporting, let's say, the Ukrainian government, supporting the Ukrainian military, and continuing to be anti-Russian. And if they don't have those kind of myths, then eventually they'll start to think differently about the situation. But the question there is, are they going to think differently because they're no longer subjected to the quote-unquote myths and propaganda, and they can start to see reality as it actually is, and then they will take action based on reality? They'll stop supporting Zelensky and Kiev. They'll stop being so anti-Russian. They'll get tired of the war. They'll stop supporting. They'll start to think that the slaughter of Ukrainian military personnel by Russians is a bad thing and it should stop. And America and Europe should stop, sending crap loads of weapons to Ukraine to continue the war. So they want to stop that from happening. That's the bottom line. If there's a myth, if they're propagating a myth that continues a war, it's not a very good myth. It's not a myth that anybody should believe. So yeah, go to Twitter there. Kirby, an example of propaganda. Caitlin Durnbos. She's actually Caitlin Durnbos. I don't know. I mean, there were other people posted this as well, but she's actually, if you just she's a Stars and Stripes Pentagon reporter. Recently returned from Yokosuka Naval Base in Japan. Anyway, so she's a Pentagon reporter. But she tweeted this little bit from a Pentagon press, I suppose, presser by John Kirby, who's the Pentagon spokesman. And I'll just preface what you're going to see here by saying that John Kirby is an admiral, I think, a former admiral in the Navy. Maybe he still is. I suppose he still are. But since 1986, he's been in the PR department of the Navy.
It's difficult to look at the It's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that. So I can't talk to his psychology, but I think we can all speak to his depravity. Barbara.
Good show, John. Jolly good show. I mean, it's not people. you don't like to turn around and say that the guy's completely faking that, because it sounds like he's being an actor. He's actually deliberately pretending to be emotionally upset at images of, he's referring to images of Ukrainian civilians, dead Ukrainian civilians, and using that then to talk to, it speaks to Putin's depravity and stuff, There's so many problems with that, with what he said there, apart from his, in my opinion, acting, and his conscious, deliberate acting is choking up a little bit, is put on. And of course, again, I understand how people say, well, why would you be so mean as to suggest that he didn't actually feel bad about those civilians? Well, he's the spokesman of the Pentagon. His job is to, at least in part, is to lie. And he has shown no remorse over the years for any of the US warmongering or the slaughter of civilians around the world. So why he suddenly would be concerned about some images that he saw of Ukrainian civilians in a war that he is playing a significant part in facilitating and perpetuating, and thereby perpetuating the role, or perpetuating the death of those civilians that he's so concerned about. That's why I'm skeptical about his emotional choking up over that. But also his suggestion that, he's saying that images of dead civilians, random dead civilians, who knows how they died, obviously, in that sense, who knows if they died as a result of Ukrainian action or Russian action. But he uses that to say that those images of dead Ukrainian civilians speak to Putin's depravity, as if Putin, Putin decided that those civilians should be killed or something, or Putin himself killed them, or gave the orders to kill them. It's just so puerile and propagandistic that I get choked up. So
I don't understand how. I want to ask people like John Kirby a question, because I made the mistake the other day of going to CNN.com. And I visit CNN regularly just to see what they're saying, And the other day I went and I looked, and it was like multiple stories of just, the Russians are horribly torturing everyone. Everything that you've seen videos of Ukrainian soldiers with the armband and everything, and they're like, shooting Russian soldiers, it's, they take everything and they flip it exactly opposite.
Right.
And every single article has a thing, oh, this is unverified. So they tell you this god-awful, horrific thing, which is the exact reversal of the truth as far as I can tell. And then they say, oh, but we're actually not sure, this is unverified. And this is what people are believing. And then they see John Kirby on TV, and he's crying or pretending to cry. And I'm going like, I grew up in, I think I was, 1991. Yeah, I was in high school when, Iraq, we're going to go bomb Saddam Hussein for the first time. And it was like...
Yay.
No, but we were like... We were the shit, man.
This was awesome.
You could go in and they could just rain these like cruise missiles.
Yeah.
They're so
Shock
precise,
and awe.
it was like shock and awe and all this stuff. And so, this is what I kind of grew up with during my most formative years. So
and many other people.
Yeah, and
In
so
America.
I have to ask myself, like, that's how I grew up, right? And then if you're continuing to read the CNN stuff and you're seeing John Kirby on TV and you're going. Right,
Such a
so
sensitive man.
If they're so all powerful, like why isn't like everyone in America, if that's what they believe, or at least the majority, why are they not insisting to John Kirby and other people that America go in there and save Ukraine?
Yeah.
They're like, no. Hey, Germany, we'll give you some weapons if you give your old weapons to Ukraine,
right?
Or will sanction, or will. So what, like in people's minds, what happened to like this all-powerful America? We can do whatever we want. Like, are their brains just that mushy or something? It's bizarre to me.
There's not a lot of thinking going on.
Back then, no Pentagon official or spokesman would get on TV and weep.
Right?
It's like,
yeah.
What?
Well, he's a Biden administration.
The whole thing is just bizarre.
He has to be woke, has to show some feels, Yeah.
I don't know. It's. I
Germany-
guess that's what it looks like when everything falls apart.
Yeah. It looks like something may happen in Transnistria, and just in case anybody's interested in Transnistria, it's. I mean, I can't predict obviously exactly what's going to happen, other than to say that the plan, the situation right now looks like that Russia will take eventually over the course of the next X number of months, that Russia will continue to. I mean, they're they've really kind of upped the game in a certain sense in Donbass in the east, basically, where most of the bulk of the Ukrainian military has been stationed for quite a long time, and was stationed there from last year. Well, before that, but really, was concentrated from late last year for a planned invasion of Donbass in March this year, which is why Russia invaded in late February. But so most of the Ukrainian military is in the east, and that's where the Russians are focusing their efforts now. And they're kind of dug in proper lines because they were planning to invade Donbass. So it's a very different situation to what has happened up until now, where Russia has been advancing slowly. They had the feint up in Kiev, where they drew troops away from the south and Mariupol to, quote unquote, defend Kiev, but that was just a feint. Russia had never any intention of trying to take Kiev. It was a ruse, essentially. But up until now, they've been they focused primarily, let's say, on in the south, in Kherson and in Mariupol, and that's a big city. Mariupol's about 500,000 people. Kherson's about 100 and some thousand, whatever. And that kind of fighting, again, the Ukrainians were dug in really well in Mariupol, as we've seen. So the going was very slow in those areas because they're major cities. But now they're just over the past week, their attacks on the bulk of the Ukrainian forces along the kind of contact line in eastern Ukraine and in the Donbass area appears to have been much more devastating, and they're really the Ukrainian military are really being hit hard, basically. And so the plan basically is to, I don't know, if you look at a map, you can see basically, but obviously the plan is the complete liberation or taking of the Donbass area, Luhansk, Donetsk. Mariupol is obviously done south and over to Kherson, right over to Odessa. So you've got pretty much all of the south coast of Ukraine, all of the Black Sea coast, and all of the east, and then extending to some extent, to one extent or another, upwards. So you're talking about maybe a third of the country, including all of the Black Sea coast, like I said, is the plan to take that part of Ukraine. It's possible, don't know how when I mentioned earlier about it, probably going to be the extension or the expansion of this conflict probably going to be facilitated by the US, or seems to be in the process of being facilitated by the US. One possible area that might happen relatively soon is in Transnistria, which is a little area of little line of Moldova. Moldova being a mostly Western aligned small country on Ukraine's border, and Transnistria being a small line of Moldova right up against Ukraine. It's possible that the US will be directing the Ukrainians to try and redirect some, or force the Russians to redirect some troops to defend Transnistria, which would obviously have because if you look at the map of Transnistria, it's very small. It would very likely extend into Moldova itself, which isn't a NATO country. It's in a NATO partnership program or something like that, but it would be the extension or the expansion of the conflict, at least outside the borders of Ukraine. Poland obviously is another. It's just asking to happen, because the Poles are. Talk about sleepwalking disaster. Germany, at least there's some sanity amongst the German politicians, and in France and in the Baltics and in Nordic countries, still some sanity, but the Poles seem to be just polls are just being polls. I don't know, because most of the military supplies to Ukraine from the US and European countries are coming through Poland. So Poland's really putting itself in the crosshairs. If at some point in the future Polish tanks, even if they've been nominally, the Polish flag crossed out and Ukrainian flag put on them, whatever. If there's Polish tanks that cross the border in significant numbers, or other military equipment starts crossing the border in significant numbers, there's a chance that it could extend. The conflict could extend into Poland. I don't think the Baltics are really an issue further north. I would say Poland is the most likely place, along with Transnistria and into Moldova, are the most likely place where you're going to get an expansion of this conflict. The Germans put up. Actually, I didn't send it to you. Just throw up this one. It's just from RT today as an example of what I was saying. The German Chancellor, per Germany, Germany's super dependent on Russian gas. Its industry would just go down the tubes overnight if they even thought about cutting off Russian gas. But Germany has a long-standing, fairly friendly relationship with going back to the Second World War, after the Second World War, with Russia. So there's a whole history there as well. I think the Kaiser Wilhelm II and Tsar and Nicholas, they were cousins. So 80 years ago, the leaders of the Soviet Union or the leaders of Russia, and 100 years ago, let's say, the leaders of Russia and the leader of Germany were cousins, were first cousins. I'm not saying that impacts today. I'm just saying that there's a particular relationship, that's different from most other European countries, between Germany and Russia. But this is Scholz, and he's come under pressure for not, even Zelensky's been bitching at him about, being too slow and supply of weapons and all that kind of stuff. And he's been coming under pressure primarily from US influences within Germany. He's been coming under pressure for the same reason. So Zelensky, complains about about Germany not supplying enough weapons, and internally the US is saying the same thing to him, which means that Zelensky is basically a spokesperson or a puppet of Washington DC. But just down 4 or 5 paragraphs, the Chancellor has previously insisted that he doesn't think it is justified for Germany and NATO to become warring parties in Ukraine, and that Germany must do everything possible to avoid a direct military confrontation between NATO and a highly armed superpower like Russia. Well, no shit. But NATO, i.e. the US, has other ideas. They have no problem with Europe being in direct military confrontation with Russia, because it would serve, at least they see it as serving US interests in basically consolidating their control, or giving them opportunities to consolidate their control over Europe. Yeah.
And in doing so, he sent all these weapons. I think it was Germany. They have no weapons left or something. They're sending so much stuff. Even America, even the US made. There was something about they what is it, Stinger or Javelin or something like that.
Yeah.
That they've actually shipped so many of them over to Ukraine that their stockpiles are becoming depleted. And they said, oh, well, we can't actually make any more of these missiles, even they're kind of older and crappier because they're 1981 era or something. And we don't have the proper components, so we'd have to design new electronics for the warheads, and it would be 2025 before we'd be able to manufacture more.
Yeah.
So even America is actually depleting. I mean, obviously they're not sending the best stuff they have, but they have tons of armaments, and they're literally. And then they're telling other countries, send all of your armaments over to Ukraine so the Russians can blow them up.
Yeah.
How is that a good strategy?
Well, it's good for the arms manufacturers. Good for the weapons
Oh, yeah, for
manufacturers.
the weapons
Yeah, for sure.
manufacturers,
They're
but-
very, very happy about it. You know, throw up that Goodreads thing just because it's on that topic. This is Harry Truman, World War II, U.S. president, talking about World War II. If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia, and if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many as possible. Although we don't want to see a Hitler victorious under any circumstances. Yeah.
That guy was crazy.
Yeah, well, that policy, that idea is you know, okay, it's 70, 80 years old, but it's exactly the same today. You just change the names, you know. And another one, again, in terms of NATO, you want to know what NATO's about? It's actually become, even by NATO's own admission, it has become the kind of defining, you know, definition, or the definition of what NATO is. Keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Those are the words of NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, when explaining the aims behind the new military alliance, as it was then back in 1958 or whatever. Keep the Russians out. The point of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And he's talking about Europe here. So keep the Russians out of Europe, the Americans in Europe, and the Germans down. And that again, that holds true today. It's the same policy. It was, you know, said in 1958, but it's the same policy that's being pursued right now in 2022. And on gas and oil, it's a big ruse. Again, it's hard. So much about this conflict and about what's going on in the world today is lies, manipulation, distortions, propaganda. I'll just say one word on sanctions. Obviously, sanctions haven't worked. The ruble is not rubble, according as Putin or as Biden thought it would be. It's actually stronger than it was before the conflict against the dollar. It's at a higher level against the dollar than it was before the conflict, before sanctions were imposed. And in terms of oil and gas embargoes, the only thing I'll say about that, and it's absolutely true, is that everybody is still buying, regardless of what you're reading in the media and what you're hearing from government in the West. Everybody who has been buying Russian oil and gas everywhere in the world is still doing so at the same capacity right now, and will be for the foreseeable future. The bullshit is so damn high that they have no problem saying, yes, we're not buying any more Russian gas, we're not buying any more Russian oil, when that's technically true. But what they're actually doing is they're buying it from a broker, basically. So, you know, this, say Poland and Bulgaria, or whoever comes online with their, we're not buying any Russian gas or oil, whoever comes online in the near future, when they say that, what they're actually doing is simply not buying it directly from Russia, from Gazprom, for example. They're buying it from an intermediary who buys it for them, so that they can officially say that they're not buying Russian gas, but they actually are, because the money's still going to Russia. But most countries actually, I think, well, not most, but 10 European countries so far have signed up to the payment in rubles scheme that the Russian government has demanded. 10 countries of Europe have so far done it. A few are still hold out, and that largely reflects the number of countries in Europe that are highly dependent on Russian gas and oil. They're the ones who are saying, listen, we can't just stop buying Russian gas and oil. Are you fucking kidding me? So they've opened accounts in Gazprom Bank, basically, and they're paying in euros, whatever they want to do, and then they're converted to rubles, and they're paid to Gazprom in rubles. And the reason, I'm sure everybody knows the reason that's being done, is because the accounts into which those countries who bought Russian gas or oil paid previously were in their own countries. So France, for example, buys, or Germany buys Russian gas or oil, and they pay Gazprom, the Russian company, they pay them into an account in Germany in euros, and Gazprom can use those euros that they get for supplying the gas. But since sanctions, all of those accounts were frozen. So Russia simply said, okay, listen, we can't get access to those accounts that you're going to pay us for our gas into. We can't get access to them because America says we're not allowed to, and you've frozen them. So you have to open an account in Russia and pay us for the gas that you buy into an account in Russia where they can't sanction. And that's called blackmail. Anyway.
We have another question. This one is from Sasha, and he says, in the Balkans, NATO's been selling their old airplanes to states there and turning Serbia against Russia via Kosovo. Any comment on that?
In the Balkans, NATO's been selling their old airplanes to who?
To states in the Balkans, I guess.
Yeah. NATO's been selling their old airplanes to states in the Balkans.
And turning Serbia against Russia via Kosovo.
Yeah. Well, they're trying to turn Serbia against Russia. And I mean, I don't have much faith in the... I mean, they're not bad, but I don't have much faith in the Serbian leadership or Serbian politicians. They're politicians. But the problem there is the Serbian people. The Serbian people are, decidedly, if it comes down, if you force them to choose, they're decidedly pro-Russian as opposed to pro-US or pro-Western, let's say. So any Serbian government has a big problem in terms of taking, enacting any policies or taking any political stance that is decidedly anti-Russian, because it's absolutely not going to be supported by the vast majority of Serbian people. So America can try all it wants to drive a wedge there or to sow discord, but I don't think they're going to get very far. They haven't got very far in the last 20 years or 20 plus years since they bombed Belgrade. It only made matters worse, So it's good to see that the Serbian people still have a good read on what's what, Funny you should mention the Serbian president. Throw up the Jugopnik Twitter thing. This is the Serbian president and Orban, the Hungarian president. It was just a month ago or so. An example of it reminds me of Kirby. Basically, it's in the context of Kirby and him choking up. Just play it there. Orban's like,
We are an alien nation here, all Slavs all
smo mi
around
bili
us.
nekako otuđena
And
nacija,
then
sve
the
su oko nas
Germans,
bili
they're
Sloveni,
very,
pa
very
onda
strange, unique
Germani, a
nation.
mi smo veoma čudna
So
i
therefore,
jedinstvena nacija. I
autonomy,
But the thing is, that happens so often, and it just so happens that in Serbian TV or whatever, they got the wrong angle, right? You're meant to be like, either he's meant to be in the seat or you're meant to angle it in such a way that you're looking in. You don't look, But that, I mean, you can imagine the amount of times that politicians anywhere around the world have done exactly that. I mean, there actually been videos of people, waving, politicians in America and in Europe waving at, or giving large speeches to what are ostensibly, large numbers of people, and then you look at the actual crowd and there's hardly anybody there, or they're waving at nobody,
Well, this one is particularly funny because it was they're waving at nobody, pretending there's a crowd gathered to celebrate the new railway line.
Yeah.
When was the last time that anyone got so excited about a new railway line that they went out and waved at the train?
I know, exactly. But if that
on
angle,
top of the idiocy of the politicians pretending that
if that angle was done better, I mean, you just see an image of him waving without looking at what he's waving at, and you would think, oh, it's amazing how I mean, that's the level of detail and thinking and psychology that the PR people and government go into, where they'll have decided correctly, I suppose, that he needs to be seen to be waving to people. It needs to be presented as if there are a lot of people out to see the president because they support him so much.
He's not just sitting on a train, which would be boring.
Right.
He's sitting on a train, and not only is everyone so excited about the new line, but they're excited to see him because they love him so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ay.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got another question. Is the Nord Stream 2 now scrapped and abandoned for sure then? Or are they secretly continuing to develop the thing to bring it online a couple years from now?
Well, they're not. It's already. It's not just. It's ready to go. It was ready to go last September. It was done. Russia was ready to open up the taps. Basically, it needed some certification process or whatever. But you notice, I remember thinking about it at the time, seeing this in September, when Russia said, "Okay, it's finished. You know, the last details of making it functional. We're just now waiting for certification." And then there was this process of, the Germans immediately said, or someone in Germany immediately said, this is going to take quite a few months to certify, you know, and this is September, right? Before any talk of Russian invasion of Ukraine or whatever, somebody back then knew what was going on, and because the way it happened, where it was like, delay, and then cancel when they had the reason to cancel, which was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You backtrack that and you realize that in September, and probably even beforehand, they knew that somebody had the intel and had the read on the situation that Russia was going to do something in Ukraine, and that it was going to become untenable for Germany to approve or to start receiving gas through Nord Stream 2. And of course, America has been behind all of the lobbying and pressure tactics placed on Germany over several years, actually, repeatedly, to get them to stop Nord Stream 2. Because they don't want Germany as the kind of industrial powerhouse of Europe, even more dependent on Russian energy, because then with energy and economic dependence comes political dependence. Not dependence, but it's partnership. You know, they call it dependence, but it's actually partnership. I have money, you have product, I buy product. There's no one in a subservient position in that relationship, really, you know.
Wait, you mean like capitalism?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Like the thing America loves. So, but they call it dependence, and Russia using it to manipulate and stuff. And it was just basically a good business deal, and they didn't want that to continue, because with good business deals comes a closer, or with closer business deals comes a closer kind of political, cultural, etc. And that was all steps towards the worst case scenario for America, where Europe decidedly went eastwards, and that's end of the line for America, and that's what they're fighting against, basically. And they're willing to sacrifice all the Ukrainians in service to their insane geopolitical goal to prevent a multipolar world from emerging, and to maintain their position as a global hegemon, which is not possible to do. So they're just going to wreck the place. It's the attitude of, if we can't be top dog, then no one can. I think we'll just have a final word, because I don't have much more unless there's another question. Final word from...
No,
are there more questions?
Well, and if you want to comment on the French elections, there are.
Probably rigged. How's that?
Done.
Rigged. Anyway. Yeah. I'll just mention one other thing nobody brought up, which is that Poland. There's talk about Poland annexing part of Western Ukraine, Lvov area, basically the eastern third, let's say, which is Poland's historical Poland, right? It used to be part of Poland, or it used to be some of it used to be part of Poland. It's all very complicated, but Russia would be very happy for that to happen. Poland, you go ahead. You have, because like Western Ukraine is primarily where it's the stronghold of the right wing Ukro nationalist ideology, and if Poland were to in some way annex it to save it, they would immediately have, or very quickly they would have a Ukrainian nationalist extremist problem on their hands, because they would see, obviously the Ukrainian nationalists would see any kind of appropriation of Western Ukraine to Poland as, they're not going to believe the anti-Russian, or this is to protect against Russia narrative. They're going to see it as a you're doing what Russia's doing, basically, and they would, Poland would have a night. Poland is just setting itself up for such a horrible situation, and it's sleepwalking towards it. It's like a train wreck in slow motion, and I don't know what it is about Poles, but anyway, that's going to happen. Well, that's what might happen if that were to. I don't think it will happen, but there's been talk about it, about Poland taking, basically expropriating or annexing part of Western Ukraine. Anyway, yeah. So the end, like I said before, Russia's most likely going to control about a third of, and it'll be either incorporated into Russia or it'll be autonomous zones or whatever. But there'll be Russian line. This is the very least, right? 1/3 of eastern Ukraine, of the whole country, will be basically owned by Russia, and then the rest will be the rump state, let's say, of Ukraine. Will be, well, whoever, it'll be Western. It'll be, you guys can take care of it. Of course, America will walk away if the dust settles and it's all over, and America has to accept that they couldn't do what they wanted to do in Ukraine. They'll walk away from Ukraine, except they'll keep the debts on the book, and they'll screw Ukraine for the next 40 years, basically, with the debts that have incurred and are incurring right now. But Europe will be left to deal with that rump state of Ukraine. And if they ever want to, if anybody has the will or the motivation to, like, use that part of rump Ukraine to invade Russia again, well, it'll just happen on Ukrainian territory, because you'll have the eastern buffer zone, basically, that'll have been taken or controlled by Russia. If there's ever another attempt to do what they're doing in Ukraine now, what they plan to do in Ukraine, it'll happen again on Ukraine, and it'll be Ukrainians against Ukrainians, effectively, or with the help of Russia. So I think that's a good, in terms of the objectives that Putin keeps talking about of the special military operation in Ukraine. That would be a good outcome. That's probably the at least one of the likely scenarios, is that about a third, like I said, of Ukraine from the east will be Russian, basically, and that's a big enough buffer zone and especially if they do that and they, everything, the dust settles, it'll be a win for Russia, and everybody will have been put on notice that, don't fuck with Russia, and attitudes will change in Europe. But we'll leave a final word, I think, because it's getting on for 2 hours. I'll leave a final word for President Zelensky. You notice in this video, he isn't in his green fatigues, which is kind of interesting, because obviously the PR department of the State Department of Washington D.C. decided very early on that Zelensky should only wear that green, fleece and the green pants, kind of like almost like camo, but not quite camo. Just average guy, not the suits anymore that he was wearing beforehand. And he's just worn the same thing. If you see any video, in that video we showed earlier on of him meeting Pelosi, he's wearing exactly the same thing. He either has like multiple copies of that outfit, or he's wearing the same clothes every day. And it's bizarre. Like, someone decided for him that he should wear that. Well, he's gonna have to wear that for the next year probably, on every single appearance on TV. Every time someone sticks a camera in his face, he better make sure he's got that green kind of fatigues outfit on, because it shows him as a man of the people. He's not a suit anymore. He's down there in the trenches. He's with his people. It's just more of the PR business or the propaganda aspect of this whole thing, which is about 90% of it, actually. Anyway, here he is, before he was president, when he was still just a comedian, which he still is, really. But he had some interesting things to say about Ukraine before he became president. It's interesting the changes that becoming president of Ukraine has on a person.
И в Крыму люди хотят говорить по-русски. Отцепитесь, отстаньте от них. На законном основании дайте им возможность говорить по-русски. Язык никогда не будет делить нашу родную страну. У меня еврейская кровь, я говорю по-русски, но я гражданин Украины. Я люблю эту страну и не хочу быть частью другой страны. Россия и Украина, мы действительно братские народы. Я знаю миллионы, я знаю тысячи людей, которые живут в России, замечательные люди. Мы одного цвета, у нас одинаковая кровь. Мы все друг друга понимаем, независимо от языка.
He said that during this is maybe 2015 or 16. So during the anti-terrorist, as they called it, anti-terrorist operation in Donbass, where the Ukrainian forces were bombing and killing civilians in Donbass. He's speaking about, in that context. But why didn't that happen? Why didn't what he said and that leave them alone? Let's not impose an anti-Russian language law in the country. Let's just have peace and let's not be antagonistic towards anybody. Russians are our friends. Russians are our brothers. Let's just all live peaceably. Why could that not happen? Why was that not the outcome of the conflict in after the coup in 2014, and then the conflict that began in Donbass by the separatists? Why was that not resolved in the way that Zelensky there was saying? Well, because America and Europe are willing to fight against Russia to the last Ukrainian. And Zelensky seems to have drunk the Kool-Aid, or something happened. Maybe he's just snorting too much cocaine since then. But anyway, it's a pity. But it's happening. And Neil hasn't said a word the whole show. I mean, Neil, spirit animal, hasn't said a word the whole show. I suppose just because you were so enthralled, right? Yeah. You're hanging on every word, dumbfounded, as usual. I know. It's hard. But maybe next week you'll have more to say. You get your thoughts together. Anyway. So is that all? I answered all the questions, right?
Yeah, that was it.
Good. Yeah, that was it for this week. No, but definitely Neil will be back next week and it'll be good because, it's kind of hard to be a one-man show here. Although I could probably get used to it, but there's too much talking. I like to have a break.
Maybe if the unicorn had a beard, it would seem more natural.
Yeah. But it's a lot of talking, especially for 2 hours almost. If I was ever going to do this on my own, I had to do it on my own. I'd definitely do shorter shows. But anyway, thanks guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for the questions. They're all very informative or useful questions. Yeah, we'll be back next week with Neil, the real Neil, and his spirit animal next week, and maybe I'll have one as well myself. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week, like I said. Until then, have fun
and smash the buttons.
And smash all the buttons. Don't forget to smash all the buttons.
Can't stop the signal now.